Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal traditions are guarded more fiercely than the crown jewels themselves, a single moment of family generosity would shatter the unspoken rules that bind the monarchy. When Queen Camilla made what seemed like a loving gesture to her daughter, she unknowingly crossed a line that would awaken the fury of those sworn to protect royal protocol. The late Queen Elizabeth II wedding dress, a symbol of duty, tradition, and an empire's hopes, had been treated as mere family inheritance. What followed was a confrontation so explosive that it would echo through the palace corridors for years to come, proving that even queens must answer to the guardians of royal legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla walked purposefully toward the royal wardrobe chambers. Her heels clicked against the ancient stones, each step echoing through hallways that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. Today, however, would mark a moment that would rival any historical scandal the castle had ever contained. Camilla had been queen consort for nearly 2 years now, yet she still felt the weight of following in the footsteps of Queen Elizabeth II, the beloved monarch who had ruled for over 70 years before her passing. The public had slowly warmed to her, but within the palace walls, tension still simmered among the old guard who remembered when she was simply Charles's controversial companion. The royal wardrobe chambers occupied an entire wing of the castle, containing thousands of garments that told the story of British monarchy. Gowns worn to coronations, dresses that had graced state dinners, and ceremonial robes that had witnessed the signing of historic treaties all hung in perfect preservation. But it was one particular dress that had captured Camilla's attention for months. Queen Elizabeth II wedding dress, designed by Norman Hartnell in 1947, remained one of the most iconic gowns in royal history. The ivory silk satin creation, embroidered with 10,000 seed pearls and decorated with orange blossoms and star flowers, had been carefully preserved behind climate-controlled glass. The dress represented not just a young princess's wedding day, but a nation's hope as it emerged from the shadows of World War II. Camilla's daughter, Laura Lopez, was preparing for her own daughter's upcoming wedding. At 25, Eliza Lopez had grown into an elegant young woman who bore a striking resemblance to her grandmother, the late Queen. The family resemblance was so pronounced that many at court had remarked how Eliza seemed to embody the grace and poise that the royal family valued above all else. The idea had formed gradually in Camilla's mind during family gatherings at Highgrove House. Watching Eliza move through the gardens with such natural elegance, seeing how she carried herself with unconscious dignity, Camilla began to envision her granddaughter in something truly spectacular for her wedding day. The family had been discussing wedding plans for months, and while Eliza had mentioned several designers, nothing seemed quite right for such a momentous occasion. It was during a quiet evening in the blue drawing room that Camilla first voiced her idea to King Charles. The fire crackled in the ornate fireplace as they reviewed the day's correspondence, a ritual that had become precious to them both in their advancing years. "Charles," she began carefully, setting down her reading glasses, "I've been thinking about Eliza's wedding." The king looked up from his papers, his weathered hands folding over the documents. At 75, Charles had learned to read his wife's tones with remarkable accuracy. This particular inflection suggested she had something significant on her mind. "The dress selection isn't going well, I take it," he replied, knowing that wedding preparations had been a source of gentle stress for the family. Camilla rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens that stretched toward the horizon. The evening light caught the diamonds in her wedding ring, sending small rainbows dancing across the wall. She's been to every designer in London, Paris, and Milan. Nothing feels right to her. She keeps saying she wants something with meaning, something that connects her to family history. Camilla paused, choosing her words carefully. "I keep thinking about your mother's wedding dress." Charles stiffened slightly. Even 2 years after his mother's death, certain subjects remained tender. The preservation of her legacy, her belongings, and her memory had become matters of almost religious significance to him. The wedding dress has been in preservation since 1947, he said slowly. It's a museum piece now, really. Part of the royal collection. But it's also family, Charles. It belonged to Eliza's great-grandmother. The girl has such reverence for tradition, such respect for the monarchy. When she looks at those portraits of your mother in the dress, her eyes just light up. Camilla turned back to face her husband, seeing the conflict written across his features. She knew she was treading on sacred ground, but something deep in her heart told her this was right. Think about it, she continued, moving closer to his chair. Your mother always said the monarchy had to adapt to survive. She believed in the importance of family, of passing traditions to the next generation. Eliza isn't just any young woman getting married. She's part of this family, part of this legacy. Charles remained silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. The weight of kingship had taught him to consider every decision from multiple angles, to anticipate consequences that might not be immediately apparent. The dress is incredibly fragile, he finally said. It's nearly 80 years old. The silk, the pearls, the embroidery, it might not survive even careful handling. But what if it could? What if we could arrange for the royal seamstresses to assess it, to see if it could be carefully altered to fit Eliza? She's almost exactly your mother's size when she married your father. The observation was accurate. Elizabeth had been a petite young woman of 21 when she married Prince Philip, and Eliza shared those same delicate proportions. The physical similarity between great-grandmother and great-granddaughter had been remarked upon by many in the family. Charles rose from his chair and joined his wife at the window. Together, they looked out at the grounds where his mother had walked for decades, where she had found peace and solitude away from the constant demands of public life. She would have loved Eliza, he murmured, almost to himself. She did love her, Charles. You saw them together at Christmas gatherings, at family celebrations. Your mother always had a special smile for that girl. This was true. Queen Elizabeth II had maintained formal relationships with many family members, but with Eliza, there had been something warmer, more immediate. Perhaps it was the girl's genuine interest in royal history, or her natural grace at formal events, but the late queen had clearly held special affection for her step-great-granddaughter. Over the following weeks, the idea took root and began to grow. Camilla found herself stealing moments to visit the wardrobe chambers, ostensibly to review her own formal wear for upcoming state functions, but always ending up before the glass case that housed the wedding dress. The dress seemed to glow under the museum-quality lighting, every seed pearl catching and reflecting the carefully calibrated illumination. The ivory silk had maintained its lustrous quality despite nearly 8 decades of careful preservation. The intricate embroidery work, featuring the rose of England, the thistle of Scotland, the daffodil of Wales, and the shamrock of Ireland, remained as detailed and beautiful as the day Norman Hartnell had completed it. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, the head of the Royal Wardrobe Department, had served the royal family for over 40 years. She had dressed queens, princesses, and duchesses for every conceivable occasion, and she understood the sacred nature of her role as guardian of royal fashion history. Your Majesty, she said during one of Camilla's visits, the dress has been examined regularly by conservation experts. It remains in remarkable condition, but it is extraordinarily delicate. In your professional opinion, Mrs. Whitmore, could it be worn again, with the proper care and alterations? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Mrs. Whitmore understood the significance of what was being asked. She also understood the weight of responsibility that would fall on her shoulders if anything went wrong. With extreme care and with the involvement of the finest conservation specialists in the world, it might be possible, she said slowly. But, Your Majesty, the risk would be considerable. Any damage to the dress would be irreversible. But if it could be done safely, the late Queen's measurements are on file, as are detailed photographs and notes from every cleaning and preservation session. If the young lady is truly similar in size and build, and if we had months to plan and prepare, Mrs. Whitmore paused, considering the logistics. It would require a team of specialists, insurance coverage worth millions of pounds, and the most careful handling imaginable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Edmund Hastings, the master of the royal household. At 68, Sir Edmund embodied the old guard of royal service. His family had served the monarchy for generations, and he viewed himself as a guardian of traditions that stretched back centuries. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow, "I was reviewing the schedule for next week's conservation assessments when Mrs. Whitmore's request for additional access to the preservation chambers caught my attention." Camilla felt her cheeks warm slightly. She had hoped to explore the possibility more thoroughly before involving the senior household staff, but clearly word of her frequent visits had reached the administrative levels of the palace. "Sir Edmund, I've been considering the possibility of incorporating some family pieces into my granddaughter's wedding preparations." "Family pieces, Your Majesty?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Sir Edmund's tone suggested he understood exactly which family piece was under consideration, and his expression indicated significant concern. "The late Queen's wedding dress," Camilla said directly, deciding that honesty was the best approach. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours rather than seconds. Mrs. Whitmore looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable at being caught between the Queen Consort and the master of the royal household. Sir Edmund's face remained carefully neutral, but Camilla could sense the storm brewing behind his diplomatic exterior. "Your Majesty," he finally said, his voice measured and careful, "that particular garment is considered a national treasure. It has been classified as part of the permanent royal collection since 1952. Any decision regarding its use would require extensive consultation and approval at the highest levels." "I'm at the highest levels, Sir Edmund," Camilla replied, allowing a hint of steel to enter her voice. "Of course, Your Majesty. However, the preservation and protection of royal historical artifacts involves multiple departments and regulations. The Board of Trustees for the Royal Collection, the conservation specialists, the insurance providers, and ultimately His Majesty's approval would all be required." Camilla nodded, recognizing the bureaucratic maze that surrounded every aspect of royal life. Even as Queen Consort, she was constantly reminded that tradition and protocol governed nearly every decision. "Then, let's begin the consultation process," she said firmly. "I'd like to explore whether this is possible, and if so, what would be required to make it happen safely and appropriately." Sir Edmund bowed again, but Camilla noticed the tightness around his eyes. This was clearly not a development he welcomed, but his role required him to facilitate the royal family's wishes, regardless of his personal opinions. Over the next several weeks, a quiet flurry of activity began behind the scenes. Conservation experts were consulted, insurance assessments were conducted, and detailed plans began to take shape. The dress was carefully removed from its display case for the first time in 5 years, and subjected to thorough examination. The results were encouraging. Despite its age, the dress had been so carefully preserved that it remained structurally sound. The silk had some expected aging, but it was stable. The pearl and embroidery work showed no signs of deterioration. Most importantly, the overall construction of the garment remained intact and potentially wearable. Eliza herself remained unaware of the developing plans. The family had decided to keep the possibility secret until they were certain it could be accomplished safely. The young woman continued her search for the perfect wedding dress, visiting designers and boutiques with increasing frustration. "I just want something that means something," she confided to her mother during a shopping trip to Bond Street. "All these dresses are beautiful, but they're just dresses. I want something that connects me to family, to history, to the people who came before me." Laura Lopez exchanged glances with her mother, knowing that Camilla's secret project might be the answer to her daughter's wishes. But until all the approvals were in place, until every risk had been assessed and mitigated, they would have to wait. Meanwhile, within the palace, word of the Queen Consort's unusual request was beginning to spread through the complex network of staff, advisors, and officials who kept the royal household functioning. Reactions range from excitement to horror, with most falling somewhere in the middle of cautious concern. The royal seamstresses, led by Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, were both thrilled and terrified at the prospect of working with such a significant historical garment. Mrs. Harper had dressed members of the royal family for over 30 years, but the opportunity to handle Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress represented the pinnacle of her profession. "It will be the honor of a lifetime," she told her assistant seamstresses during a private meeting in their workroom. But the responsibility would be enormous. One mistake, one careless moment, and we could damage something irreplaceable. The insurance assessments alone took weeks to complete. Lloyd's of London assigned their most senior specialists to evaluate the dress and determine coverage requirements. The final assessment valued the garment at over £15 million, not just for its materials and craftsmanship, but for its historical significance and irreplaceable nature. As spring turned towards summer, the momentum behind the project continued to build. King Charles had given his cautious approval, provided that every precaution was taken and every expert consulted. The Board of Trustees for the Royal Collection had been briefed and had agreed to consider the request, pending final safety and conservation reports. But not everyone within the palace community was pleased with the developing plans. Among the royal protection officers, the household guard, and the senior staff who had served Queen Elizabeth II personally, there was a growing sense of unease. These men and women had dedicated their lives to preserving and protecting everything associated with the late queen. They had stood watch over her person, her residences, and her possessions for decades. The idea of removing her wedding dress from its protected status and potentially exposing it to damage struck many of them as almost sacrilegious. Sergeant Major William Harrison had served in the household division for over 30 years. He had been present at countless state occasions, had stood guard during the Queen's most important moments, and had developed an almost mystical devotion to preserving her memory and legacy. At 55, he represented the institutional memory of the royal household, and he was deeply troubled by what he was hearing through the palace grapevine. "It's not right," he confided to his colleague, Regimental Sergeant Major Thomas Mitchell, during their evening rounds. "That dress isn't just a family heirloom. It's a symbol of everything Her late Majesty represented. It belongs in preservation, not at some family wedding." Mitchell, equally devoted to the late Queen's memory, nodded grimly. "The new Queen consort doesn't understand. She thinks this is just about family sentiment, but that dress represents the monarchy itself. It represents the hope and faith of the entire nation on the Queen's wedding day." These conversations were happening throughout the palace, in the quarters of the household staff, among the protection officers, and in the administrative offices where the daily business of monarchy was conducted. A quiet resistance was forming, not against Queen Camilla personally, but against what many saw as a dangerous precedent that could undermine the careful preservation of royal history. The tension was building toward a confrontation that none of them could have anticipated, least of all Queen Camilla, who continued her planning with the innocent belief that she was honoring family tradition rather than challenging it. The summer months brought an intensification of wedding preparations throughout the royal household. Eliza Lopez had finally been informed of her grandmother's extraordinary plan, and her reaction had been everything Camilla had hoped for. The young woman had wept with joy at the honor, understanding immediately the magnitude of what was being offered to her. "Great-grandmother's dress," Eliza had whispered, her hands trembling as she looked at the photographs Mrs. Whitmore had carefully assembled. "You mean I could actually wear the dress she wore when she married great-grandfather Philip?" The emotional weight of the moment had not been lost on anyone present. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who had maintained professional composure throughout decades of royal service, had found herself dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But as the plans moved forward, the undercurrents of opposition within the palace began to surface more prominently. The royal household operated on a complex hierarchy of duty, tradition, and personal loyalty that outsiders rarely understood. Those who had served Queen Elizabeth II personally felt a deep, almost spiritual obligation to protect her memory and legacy from any perceived threat. Sergeant Major Harrison had been conducting his own quiet investigation into the proposed use of the wedding dress. What he discovered only deepened his concern. The dress would need to be transported from Windsor Castle to the workrooms at Buckingham Palace, where the royal seamstresses would conduct their alterations. From there, it would travel to Eliza's family home for fittings, then to the wedding venue, and, finally, back to its permanent home. Each movement represented a risk, each handling an opportunity for damage. Harrison had calculated that the dress would be exposed to potential harm at least a dozen times during the process, not counting the actual wedding day itself. 12 separate opportunities for disaster, he told his superior, Colonel James Weatherby, during their weekly briefing. 12 chances for something irreplaceable to be damaged or destroyed. Colonel Weatherby, himself a man steeped in royal tradition and deeply devoted to the memory of Queen Elizabeth II, shared Harrison's concerns. But he also understood the delicate nature of his position. Openly opposing the Queen Consort's wishes would be tantamount to insubordination, yet allowing potential damage to the late Queen's most precious possessions felt like a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. "Have you considered raising your concerns through official channels?" the colonel asked carefully. "Sir Edmund Hastings has made it clear that this decision comes from the highest levels. The Queen Consort has the King's support, and the conservation experts have given their qualified approval. What official channels remain?" It was a question that struck to the heart of the dilemma facing many longtime royal servants. Their primary duty was to serve the current monarch and his family, but their deepest loyalty remained with the memory of the sovereign they had served for decades. Meanwhile, the practical preparations continued with increasing intensity. Mrs. Harper and her team of seamstresses had been granted unprecedented access to the dress for detailed measurements and assessment. Working in specially prepared, climate-controlled rooms, they documented every aspect of the garment's construction. The process revealed new appreciation for the skill of Norman Hartnell and his team. The dress had been constructed with techniques that were becoming lost arts, using methods that required both extraordinary patience and exceptional skill. The seed pearls had been individually sewn by hand, each one secured with silk thread that had aged to match the ivory of the dress perfectly. "It's like handling a piece of living history," Mrs. Harper told her assistant during one of their careful examination sessions. "Every stitch tells a story about the craftspeople who created it, about the young princess who wore it, about the hopes and dreams of an entire nation emerging from war." But Mrs. Harper also understood the concerns being voiced throughout the palace. The dress was indeed fragile, despite its remarkable state of preservation. The silk, while stable, showed signs of the inevitable aging that came with nearly 8 decades of existence. Any stress, any unexpected force, any careless handling could potentially cause irreversible damage. The seamstresses developed increasingly elaborate protocols for working with the dress. Special tools were created, unique techniques were developed, and every session was documented with the precision of a scientific experiment. Yet despite all these precautions, the fundamental risk remained. As summer progressed toward autumn, the opposition to the project became more organized. A group of senior household staff, led informally by Sergeant Major Harrison, began meeting to discuss their concerns. They called themselves the Guardians, and they saw themselves as the final defenders of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy. The group included not just military personnel, but also long-serving members of the domestic staff, protection officers, and administrative personnel who had worked closely with the late Queen. What united them was their shared belief that the wedding dress represented something too sacred to risk. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell had served as one of Queen Elizabeth's personal dressers for over 25 years. She had helped the Queen into countless gowns for state occasions, had carefully maintained her wardrobe, and had been present for some of the most intimate moments of royal preparation. To her, the wedding dress was not just a garment, but a holy relic. "I was there when she last looked at that dress," Mrs. Campbell told the other guardians during one of their evening meetings. It was just months before she passed. She asked me to take it out of preservation so she could see it one more time. She stood there for the longest time, just touching the fabric gently, remembering. The story moved even the most hardened members of the group. The image of the elderly queen, in her final months, seeking comfort in memories of her wedding day, seemed to crystallize everything they felt about the sanctity of preserving her belongings unchanged. She trusted us to keep it safe, Mrs. Campbell continued, her voice breaking slightly. She trusted us to make sure it would be there for future generations to see and remember. How can we let it be used as a party dress? The characterization was unfair, and everyone knew it. Eliza's wedding was hardly a casual party, and the respect being shown for the dress's significance was evident in every aspect of the planning. But emotions were running high, and logic was being overwhelmed by sentiment and protective instinct. The guardians began to develop their own plans. They couldn't directly oppose the queen consort's wishes, but they could find ways to express their concerns more publicly. They could ensure that any problems or risks were fully documented. They could make their feelings known in ways that might influence the decision-makers. Unknown to them, their activities had not gone unnoticed. Colonel Weatherby, despite his own reservations about the dress project, was troubled by the growing organized resistance within his ranks. The royal household depended on discipline and hierarchy to function effectively, and the emergence of a quasi-rebellious group threatened that stability. He decided to address the situation directly. During a formal inspection of the household division, he spoke privately with Sergeant Major Harrison. "I'm aware of the concerns being expressed about the wedding dress situation," the colonel said carefully. "I want you to know that these concerns have been noted and passed up the chain of command. But I also need you to understand that organized resistance to royal family decisions is not acceptable." Harrison stiffened to attention. "Sir, we are simply expressing our professional opinions about the risks to royal property under our protection." "Your professional opinions are valued, Sergeant Major, but forming groups and holding meetings to oppose royal family decisions crosses a line. The household staff serves at the pleasure of the royal family, and our duty is to execute their wishes safely and effectively, not to second-guess their judgment." The conversation was civil but firm. Colonel Weatherby was making clear that while individual concerns would be heard, organized opposition would not be tolerated. Harrison understood the message, but it did little to diminish his determination to protect what he saw as Queen Elizabeth's legacy. As autumn arrived and the wedding date approached, the intensity of preparations reached fever pitch. The dress had been successfully transported to the Buckingham Palace workrooms, where Mrs. Harper and her team began the delicate process of alterations. The work was painstaking beyond imagination. Every adjustment had to be made with tools specifically designed for working with aged silk. The room was maintained at precise temperature and humidity levels. Each session was limited to 2 hours to minimize exposure, and every step was documented with both photography and detailed written notes. Eliza came for her first fitting on a crisp October morning, accompanied by her mother Laura and grandmother Camilla. The young woman had been preparing emotionally for this moment for weeks, but nothing could have readied her for the reality of seeing Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress laid out before her. The gown seemed to glow in the carefully controlled lighting of the fitting room. Every detail that had been described to her was now visible in magnificent reality. The intricate embroidery work depicting the floral emblems of the United Kingdom's constituent nations seemed to tell the story of the monarchy itself. The thousands of seed pearls caught the light like captured stars. "Oh my," Eliza whispered, her hand moving unconsciously toward her heart. "It's even more beautiful than in the photographs." Mrs. Harper approached the dress with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she began the process of helping Eliza into the gown. Every touch was calculated, every adjustment measured twice before being made. The fit was remarkable. Queen Elizabeth had indeed been almost exactly Eliza's size when she married Prince Philip in 1947. The bodice settled perfectly across Eliza's shoulders. The waistline fell precisely at the right point, and the length was nearly perfect. Camilla found herself wiping away tears as she watched her granddaughter transform before her eyes. In the wedding dress, Eliza seemed to embody not just her own beauty and grace, but something of a young Princess Elizabeth who had worn it decades earlier. "You look like her," Camilla said softly. "You look exactly like she did in the wedding photographs." It was true. The resemblance was striking not just in physical terms, but in the way Eliza carried herself in the dress. There was the same combination of dignity and joy, the same sense of a young woman stepping into her destiny. But even in this moment of triumph, the undercurrents of tension remained. Mrs. Harper was acutely aware of the criticism being whispered throughout the palace. She knew that every member of her team was under intense scrutiny, that any mistake would be magnified and remembered forever. The fitting proceeded without incident, but everyone present understood the enormous responsibility they carried. This was not just about one young woman's wedding dress anymore. It had become a symbol of competing visions about how royal traditions should be preserved and honored. As they prepared to remove the dress after the fitting, Mrs. Harper noticed Sergeant Major Harrison standing in the corridor outside the workroom. He was not supposed to be in that area during fitting sessions, and his presence seemed somehow ominous. When she emerged from the workroom to address his presence, Harrison was polite but firm. "I'm conducting security assessments for all areas where royal historical artifacts are being handled," he explained. "There have been concerns raised about proper protection protocols." Mrs. Harper understood immediately that this was about more than security. This was about the organized resistance to the project that she had been hearing about through the palace grapevine. "Sergeant Major, I can assure you that every possible precaution is being taken. The dress is being treated with the utmost care and respect." "I'm sure it is, Mrs. Harper. But care and respect don't eliminate risk. Every time that dress is moved, every time it's handled, every time it's exposed to the outside world, we risk losing something irreplaceable." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Edmund Hastings, who had been monitoring the fitting session from his office. His expression suggested that he was displeased to find Harrison in the area. "Sergeant Major, you have no authorized reason to be in this section of the palace during fitting sessions." Harrison came to attention immediately. "Sir Edmund, I was conducting routine security assessments as part of my duties." "Your duties do not include unauthorized surveillance of royal family activities. I want you to report to Colonel Weatherby immediately." The exchange was formal but tense, and everyone present understood that larger forces were at work. The conflict over the wedding dress was escalating beyond simple professional disagreement into something approaching open rebellion. After Harrison departed, Sir Edmund turned to Mrs. Harper with obvious concern. "Are there any legitimate security issues I should be aware of?" "No, Sir Edmund. The Sergeant Major's concerns appear to be more philosophical than practical. The actual security arrangements are more than adequate." But even as she spoke, Mrs. Harper felt a chill of apprehension. The resistance to the project was becoming more visible, more organized, and potentially more dangerous. She understood that the success of her work depended not just on her technical skill, but on navigating the complex emotional and political currents swirling around the dress. That evening, as she carefully returned the dress to its specially prepared storage area, Mrs. Harper found herself wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. The dress was indeed beautiful on Eliza, and the young woman clearly deserved such an honor. But the price of that honor was becoming higher than anyone had anticipated. In another part of the palace, Sergeant Major Harrison was receiving a formal reprimand from Colonel Weatherby for his unauthorized presence in the workroom area. But rather than discouraging him, the reprimand only strengthened his resolve. The Guardians were not going to give up easily. They had sworn oaths to protect royal property and preserve royal traditions. In their minds, They were the only things standing between Queen Elizabeth's precious wedding dress and potential disaster. The confrontation that was building would test not just their loyalty and courage, but the very foundations of how the royal household operated. Traditional hierarchy was colliding with personal conviction, and the result was going to be explosive. November brought with it the final preparations for what had become the most scrutinized royal family wedding in recent memory. Word of Queen Camilla's decision to allow her granddaughter to wear Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress had somehow leaked beyond the palace walls, creating a media sensation that no one had anticipated. The British press, always hungry for royal stories, had latched onto the narrative with unprecedented intensity. Some newspapers praised the gesture as a beautiful family tradition that honored the late Queen's memory. Others questioned whether such a precious historical artifact should be risked for a private family celebration. The debate had spilled over into social media, where opinions ranged from heartwarming support to outraged opposition. Within the palace, the external pressure only intensified the internal divisions that had been building for months. Queen Camilla found herself defending her decision not just to skeptical staff members, but to members of Parliament, representatives from the Museum and Galleries Association, and even officials from UNESCO who expressed concerns about the handling of cultural artifacts. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Dame Patricia Fielding, the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, requested a private meeting with Queen Camilla. Dame Patricia was one of the world's leading experts on textile preservation and had served as an advisor to the royal collection for over 15 years. "Your Majesty," Dame Patricia began during their meeting in the yellow drawing room at Buckingham Palace, "I must express my deep concerns about the current plans for Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress." Camilla set down her teacup carefully, recognizing the gravity in Dame Patricia's voice. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, knowing that the museum community would eventually weigh in on the controversy. "I appreciate your concerns, Dame Patricia, but surely the dress can be worn safely if proper precautions are taken." "Your Majesty, that dress is not simply a family heirloom. It is one of the most significant textile artifacts in British history. It represents not just the personal story of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, but the hopes and aspirations of the British people at a crucial moment in our national recovery from war." Dame Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "I've prepared a detailed analysis of the risks involved in this undertaking. The dress is nearly 80 years old. The silk, while stable, has undergone inevitable aging processes. The weight of the embroidery and pearls creates stress points that could fail under the strain of actual wearing." The technical discussion that followed was sobering. Dame Patricia explained how museum quality preservation depended on controlling every environmental factor that could affect textile artifacts. Temperature, humidity, light exposure, air quality, and handling frequency all played crucial roles in maintaining the integrity of historical garments. Each time the dress is moved, each time it's tried on, each time it's exposed to natural light or body heat or perfume, or any of the thousands of variables present at a wedding, we risk irreversible damage, Dame Patricia continued. "Your Majesty, if something goes wrong, there is no way to repair or restore the dress to its current condition." Camilla listened carefully to these concerns, but her resolve remained firm. "Dame Patricia, I understand the risks, but I also understand the importance of family, of tradition, of connecting the younger generation to their heritage. Queen Elizabeth herself believed in the living monarchy, not the museum monarchy. With respect, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth also understood the importance of preservation. She was extremely careful about when and how her historical garments were displayed or handled. She never wore her wedding dress after her wedding day, precisely because she understood its historical significance." The meeting ended without resolution, but Dame Patricia's visit had achieved its intended effect. The scientific and cultural arguments against the project were now formally on record, adding another layer of pressure to an already complex situation. Meanwhile, The Guardians have been developing their own strategy for protecting what they saw as Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Led by Sergeant Major Harrison, they had compiled their own dossier of risks and concerns, which they planned to present to King Charles himself, if necessary. Harrison had spent sleepless nights crafting a letter that would express their concerns while remaining within the bounds of proper protocol. The document, reviewed and endorsed by dozens of loyal staff members, represented the collective voice of those who had served the late Queen most closely. "Your Majesty," the letter began, "we, the undersigned members of the royal household staff, feel compelled to express our deep concerns regarding the proposed use of Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress for a private family occasion." The letter went on to detail the specific risks involved, the emotional significance of the dress to those who had served the late Queen, and their fear that using it for a contemporary wedding would diminish its historical importance. Most significantly, it requested that the king personally review the decision and consider alternative ways to honor family tradition without risking irreplaceable royal heritage. The letter was signed by over 60 members of the household staff, from senior administrators to kitchen staff who had served the royal family for decades. It represented an unprecedented level of organized opposition to a royal family decision. Colonel Weatherby was the first to see the letter before it was submitted, and he was deeply troubled by its contents. Not because he disagreed with the concerns expressed, but because it represented a level of organized resistance that could undermine the entire structure of royal household management. "Sergeant Major," he said during a private meeting in his office, "this letter crosses every line of proper protocol. You are essentially organizing a rebellion against the royal family's decisions." Harrison remained at attention, his face set with determination. "Sir, we are exercising our duty to protect royal property and preserve royal traditions. We have tried to express our concerns through proper channels, but those concerns have been dismissed." "The concerns have not been dismissed, Harrison. They have been considered and weighed against other factors. The royal family has decided to proceed, and our duty is to execute their decision as safely and professionally as possible. But, sir, what if we know that decision is wrong? What if we know it will cause irreparable harm to something we've sworn to protect?" It was a question that struck to the heart of the conflict between duty and conscience that was tearing through the royal household. Weatherby himself had served Queen Elizabeth for over 30 years and felt the same protective instincts toward her memory that motivated Harrison and the others. "Then, we do everything in our power to minimize that harm while respecting the chain of command that makes this institution function," Weatherby replied finally. "We do not organize rebellions, no matter how noble our intentions." But Harrison and the Guardians had moved beyond the point where warnings about protocol could deter them. The letter was delivered to the king's private secretary the next morning, creating immediate consternation throughout the upper levels of palace administration. King Charles read the letter in the privacy of his study, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the weight of centuries of royal tradition. The concerns expressed were articulated respectfully, but firmly, and they clearly represented the genuine feelings of people who had devoted their lives to serving his mother. The king's own feelings about the wedding dress project were complicated. His initial support for Camilla's idea had been based on love for his family and desire to honor his mother's memory through continued family connections. But the growing opposition and the risks outlined by various experts had created nagging doubts. He requested a private meeting with Sir Edmund Hastings to discuss the situation. The two men had worked together for years, and Charles valued Edmund's judgment on matters of household management and protocol. "This letter represents something I've never seen before," Charles said, holding the document carefully. "Organized opposition from the household staff to a family decision. How do we handle something like this?" Sir Edmund had been dreading this conversation since the letter arrived. "Your Majesty, the situation is unprecedented in my experience. The level of concern expressed is genuine and comes from people whose loyalty to the royal family is unquestioned. But the method of expression is problematic. What do you recommend?" "I think we need to address the concerns directly and publicly. Perhaps a meeting with the senior staff members who signed the letter, where they can express their concerns directly to you and receive assurance that every possible precaution is being taken. Charles considered this suggestion carefully. Public engagement with staff concerns could validate their opposition and encourage similar challenges to royal decisions in the future. But ignoring their concerns entirely could create a more serious morale and loyalty crisis. Schedule the meeting, he decided finally. But make it clear that this is a one-time exception to normal protocol, granted in recognition of the extraordinary circumstances and the genuine concern for my mother's memory. Word of the planned meeting spread quickly through the palace, creating excitement among the guardians and concern among those who supported Queen Camilla's project. Everyone understood that this meeting could determine the future of the wedding dress plan and potentially set precedents for how royal family decisions would be challenged in the future. Mrs. Harper and her seamstresses found themselves caught in the middle of the escalating conflict. Their professional reputations depended on successfully completing the alterations to the wedding dress, but they were increasingly aware that any mistake would be magnified by the intense scrutiny surrounding the project. The work continued with meticulous care. Each session with the dress was preceded by detailed preparation and followed by extensive documentation. Photographs were taken before and after every handling, temperature, and humidity readings were recorded continuously, and every tool used was specially selected for its gentleness on aged fabric. But the pressure was taking its toll on everyone involved. Mrs. Harper had lost weight and developed a nervous habit of checking her hands for tremors before each session. Her assistants worked in tense silence, acutely aware that one careless moment could end their careers and damage something irreplaceable. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, Mrs. Harper confided to her sister during a rare evening off, but I've never felt pressure like this. Every stitch could be scrutinized by historians for centuries to come." The external pressures were equally intense. Media requests for information about the dress project arrived daily. Fashion experts offered opinions about whether the alterations were appropriate. Royal historians debated the precedent being set. International news outlets picked up the story, making it a global conversation about the balance between preservation and living tradition. Queen Camilla herself was feeling the weight of the controversy she had inadvertently created. What had begun as a loving gesture toward her granddaughter had evolved into a major royal crisis with implications far beyond one family's wedding plans. During her weekly meeting with her private secretary, she expressed her growing doubts about the project. "Perhaps we should reconsider," she said quietly, standing at the window of her private sitting room. "I never intended to create such division and controversy." Her private secretary, Lady Margaret Thornfield, had been monitoring the situation carefully and had her own concerns about the long-term implications of the growing opposition. "Your Majesty, stepping back now could be seen as capitulating to internal pressure and could encourage similar challenges to future decisions. But continuing forward against such organized opposition could create permanent divisions within the household." It was a no-win situation that reflected the broader challenges facing the modern monarchy. Every decision was scrutinized, every tradition was debated, and every attempt to balance preservation with adaptation created new controversies. As the date for King Charles's meeting with the concerned staff members approached, both sides prepared their arguments with the intensity of lawyers preparing for a crucial trial. The guardians refined their presentation of risks and concerns, while supporters of the project prepared counterarguments about family tradition and the late Queen's own beliefs about the living monarchy. The meeting would take place in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, a setting chosen to emphasize both the gravity of the situation and the ultimate authority of the crown. It would be the first time in modern royal history that household staff would be granted such direct access to voice opposition to a royal family decision. Everyone involved understood that the outcome of this meeting would determine not just the fate of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, but the future relationship between the royal family and the people who served them. The stakes could not have been higher, and the potential for lasting damage to palace relationships was enormous. Sergeant Major Harrison spent the evening before the meeting reviewing his presentation one final time. He understood that he was walking a fine line between duty and insubordination, between protecting the late Queen's legacy and challenging the current Queen Consort's authority. But in his mind, the choice was clear. Queen Elizabeth II had trusted him to protect her most precious possessions, and he would not fail in that trust, regardless of the personal consequences he might face. The morning of the historic meeting dawned gray and drizzling, as if the London weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over Buckingham Palace. King Charles had spent a restless night contemplating the unprecedented nature of what was about to unfold. Never in his memory had household staff formally requested an audience to oppose a royal family decision. The throne room had been prepared with careful attention to protocol. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing the ornate gilded thrones that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies. The setting was both magnificent and intimidating, designed to remind everyone present of the weight of monarchical authority while still providing a forum for unprecedented dialogue. Sergeant Major Harrison arrived early, accompanied by 12 senior members of the household staff who represented the broader group of concerned employees. Each had been selected for their years of service, their direct experience with Queen Elizabeth II, and their ability to articulate the concerns that had been building for months. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell, the former royal dresser, carried with her a leather portfolio containing photographs from her years of service to the late Queen. Colonel Weatherby attended in his official capacity, though his personal sympathies remained conflicted. Sir Edmund Hastings represented the administrative perspective, while Mrs. Whitmore from the Royal Wardrobe brought her expertise in textile preservation. King Charles entered the throne room precisely at the appointed time, accompanied by Queen Camilla and a small entourage of senior advisors. The contrast was stark, the sovereign and his consort in formal morning dress, facing a group of devoted servants who had rarely, if ever, been granted such direct access to royal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," the king began, his voice carrying the weight of inherited authority, but also a note of genuine concern. "I have reviewed your letter and understand your concerns about the wedding dress project. This meeting is being granted in recognition of your long service to my mother and your obvious devotion to preserving her memory." Sergeant Major Harrison rose first, his military bearing evident as he came to attention before speaking. "Your Majesty, we are grateful for this opportunity to express our concerns directly. We want to emphasize that our opposition comes not from any disrespect toward Queen Camilla or your family, but from our deep sense of duty toward preserving Queen Elizabeth's legacy." The king nodded, encouraging Harrison to continue. "Your Majesty, that wedding dress represents more than a beautiful garment. It embodies the hopes of the British people at a crucial moment in our history. It connects us to the young princess who became our beloved queen, who dedicated her life to service and duty. Those of us who were privileged to serve her feel a sacred obligation to protect the physical objects that represent her memory." Mrs. Campbell rose next, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her portfolio of photographs. "Your Majesty, may I share something personal?" At the king's nod, she continued, "These photographs show some of the private moments I shared with your mother over 25 years of service. Here she is preparing for state dinners, for Christmas broadcasts, for meetings with world leaders. But this photograph," she held up a picture showing the elderly queen examining her wedding dress in its display case. "This was taken just months before she passed. She asked me specifically to show her the dress one more time." The emotion in Mrs. Campbell's voice was palpable as she continued. "She stood there for nearly an hour, Your Majesty, just looking at it, touching it gently, remembering. She told me that dress represented the most important day of her personal life, but also the moment she truly committed herself to serving the crown and the people. She said it should be preserved exactly as it was, so future generations could understand what that commitment meant. Queen Camilla shifted slightly in her chair, clearly moved by the testimony, but also defensive of her own position. The king maintained his formal composure, but those who knew him well could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Mrs. Whitmore presented the technical concerns with professional precision, outlining the specific risks involved in moving, altering, and wearing a garment of such age and delicacy. Her presentation included detailed photographs showing areas of particular vulnerability, along with expert assessments from leading textile conservators. Your Majesty, she concluded, while every precaution has been taken, the fundamental risk remains. This dress cannot be replaced if damaged. No amount of expertise or care can eliminate the possibility of irreversible harm. The presentations continued for nearly an hour, each staff member adding their voice to the collective concern. The arguments were respectful but passionate, technical but deeply personal. These were people who had dedicated their lives to serving the monarchy, and their devotion to Queen Elizabeth's memory was unmistakable. When the presentations concluded, King Charles remained silent for several moments, clearly weighing the arguments he had heard. Queen Camilla requested permission to respond, her voice carefully controlled but showing signs of stress. I want to thank each of you for your service to my late mother-in-law and for your obvious devotion to her memory, she began. But I would ask you to consider that Queen Elizabeth herself believed in the living monarchy, not the museum monarchy. She understood that traditions must be passed down through generations, not simply preserved behind glass. Queen Camilla rose from her chair and moved closer to the assembled staff members, her tone becoming more personal and direct. My granddaughter Eliza has the same measurements, the same bearing, and, frankly, much of the same character as Queen Elizabeth had at that age. When she wears that dress, she won't just be borrowing a beautiful gown. She'll be connecting with her heritage, understanding in the most visceral way possible what it means to be part of this family's legacy. The Queen Consort's voice strengthened as she continued her defense. Moreover, Queen Elizabeth wore that dress. She didn't preserve it unworn for posterity. She put it on, walked in it, danced in it, lived in it for one of the most important days of her life. She understood that some things are meant to be used, not just admired. Mrs. Campbell rose again, her voice respectful but firm. Your Majesty, with great respect, Queen Elizabeth wore that dress once, on her wedding day, understanding even then its historical significance. She never wore it again precisely because she recognized that it belonged to history, not to her personal wardrobe. The exchange that followed grew increasingly tense, though it remained within the bounds of royal protocol. Both sides presented compelling arguments, but the fundamental philosophical difference remained unbridgeable. The Guardians saw the dress as a sacred relic to be preserved unchanged. Queen Camilla saw it as a family heirloom to be cherished and used by subsequent generations. King Charles finally intervened, raising his hand to halt the discussion. I have heard both perspectives, he said solemnly, and I understand the sincerity and depth of feeling on both sides. This is clearly a matter that goes far beyond the simple question of one wedding dress. It touches on fundamental questions about how we balance preservation with tradition, how we honor the past while serving the present. The king paused, and everyone present understood that his next words would determine the outcome of months of planning and controversy. However, he continued, I must also consider the precedent being set here today. If the household staff can formally oppose royal family decisions through organized petitions and demand for audiences, where does such opposition end? How do we maintain the structure and hierarchy that allows this institution to function effectively? Sergeant Major Harrison felt his heart sink as he recognized the direction of the king's reasoning. But Charles was not finished. That said, the concerns you have expressed are legitimate and deserve serious consideration. I am therefore ordering an immediate independent assessment of the wedding dress project by a panel of international experts in textile preservation, royal history, and museum management. This assessment will be completed within 1 week, and its recommendations will be final and binding. The announcement surprised everyone present. Neither side had anticipated this solution, which acknowledged the legitimacy of the staff's concerns while maintaining royal authority over the ultimate decision. Furthermore, the king continued, "I want to make clear that this extraordinary meeting is granted in recognition of the unique circumstances surrounding this decision and the obvious devotion to my mother's memory that motivates your concerns. It should not be seen as establishing a precedent for future challenges to royal family decisions." Sir Edmund Hastings stepped forward to clarify the practical implications of the king's decision. The expert panel will consist of 3 members: Dame Patricia Fielding from the Victoria and Albert Museum, Professor James Henderson from the Institute for Conservation at University College London, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who is internationally recognized as the leading expert on royal ceremonial textiles. They will have complete access to the dress, all documentation related to the project, and the freedom to make whatever recommendation they believe is in the best interest of preserving this important historical artifact. The meeting concluded with formal acknowledgments of the king's decision, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Both sides understood that the expert panel's assessment would likely be influenced by the unprecedented nature of the staff opposition as much as by purely technical considerations. As the participants filed out of the throne room, small groups formed in the corridors discussing the implications of what had just occurred. The Guardians felt vindicated that their concerns had been formally recognized and would receive independent review. Supporters of Queen Camilla's project worried that the expert panel would be biased toward preservation over family tradition. Mrs. Harper and her seamstresses found themselves in a particularly difficult position. Their work on the dress alterations was nearly complete, but they now had to wait to learn whether their efforts had been wasted. The stress of the situation was beginning to affect their health and their ability to focus on other royal wardrobe responsibilities. Queen Camilla retreated to her private apartments, deeply shaken by the morning's events. What had begun as a loving gesture toward her granddaughter had evolved into a crisis that threatened to undermine her authority as queen consort and create permanent divisions within the royal household. "Perhaps I should have listened more carefully to the early warnings," she confided to Lady Margaret Thornfield during their debriefing session. "I was so focused on creating something beautiful for Eliza that I didn't fully consider the broader implications." But even as she expressed these doubts, Camilla remained convinced that her fundamental position was correct. The monarchy needed to remain a living institution, connected to real families and real emotions, not just a collection of museum pieces and ceremonial functions. The announcement of the expert panel assessment created immediate media interest, with royal correspondents speculating about the likely outcome and its broader implications for the monarchy. Fashion experts, historians, and preservation specialists offered opinions through every available media channel. Dame Patricia Fielding, Professor Henderson, and Dr. Mitchell accepted their appointments with full awareness of the scrutiny their decision would receive. They requested immediate access to the dress and all related documentation, understanding that they had been tasked with resolving a conflict that had paralyzed the royal household for months. The expert panel began their assessment the following day, working with the methodical precision that their reputations demanded. They examined every aspect of the dress's condition, reviewed all the alteration work that had been completed, assessed the risk factors involved in the proposed wedding use, and interviewed key personnel from both sides of the controversy. Their preliminary findings were sobering. While the dress remained in remarkable condition for its age, the stress factors involved in wearing it for a contemporary wedding were indeed significant. The weight of the embroidery and pearls, the movement required for walking and dancing, the exposure to perfumes, oils from skin contact, and the general environmental factors of a wedding celebration all posed legitimate risks. But the experts also recognized the cultural and emotional arguments in favor of allowing the dress to be worn. The connection between Queen Elizabeth's legacy and Her great-granddaughter's wedding represented exactly the kind of living tradition that many argued was essential to the monarchy's continued relevance. As their week of assessment drew to a close, the three experts found themselves facing the same philosophical divide that had paralyzed the royal household. The technical arguments for preservation were compelling, but the emotional and cultural arguments for use were equally valid. Their final meeting to determine their recommendation lasted late into the evening, with passionate arguments on both sides. The decision they reached would not only determine the fate of one wedding dress, but would establish principles for how the royal family would balance preservation with tradition for generations to come. The tension throughout Buckingham Palace was palpable as everyone waited for the expert panel's final report. Both sides had invested so much in the outcome that compromise seemed impossible, and the losing side would inevitably feel betrayed by the process. Sergeant Major Harrison spent the final night before the announcement reviewing his own conscience and his obligations. If the panel ruled in favor of using the dress, would he be able to accept that decision and continue serving faithfully? Or would his oath to protect royal property require him to take more drastic action? Similar soul-searching was occurring throughout the palace, as staff members contemplated what they would do if their deeply held beliefs about preserving Queen Elizabeth's legacy were officially overruled. The unity and loyalty that had always characterized the royal household was fracturing along lines that might prove impossible to repair. The morning of the expert panel's report arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the chilled atmosphere within Buckingham Palace. King Charles had requested that the findings be presented in the same throne room where the staff concerns had been voiced, creating a sense of formal resolution to the unprecedented crisis. Dame Patricia Fielding, Professor Henderson, and Dr. Mitchell entered the throne room carrying leather portfolios that contained not just their technical assessment, but a decision that would affect relationships within the royal household for years to come. Their week of intensive investigation had been thorough and exhausting, requiring them to balance scientific objectivity with sensitivity to the powerful emotions surrounding Queen Elizabeth's legacy. King Charles and Queen Camilla were present, along with the senior members of the household staff who had initiated the controversy. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, as everyone understood that the expert panel's recommendation would be final and binding. Dame Patricia stepped forward to present their findings, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Your Majesty, we have completed our comprehensive assessment of the wedding dress project. Our investigation included detailed physical examination of the garment, review of all alteration work completed to date, analysis of risk factors, and extensive consultation with international experts in textile preservation. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a bound report that represented hundreds of hours of meticulous analysis. From a purely technical standpoint, she continued, the dress remains in remarkable condition for a garment approaching 80 years of age. The silk foundation is stable, the embroidery work shows no signs of deterioration, and the overall structural integrity of the garment is sound. Sergeant Major Harrison and the other guardians leaned forward slightly, trying to read the implications of these preliminary findings. The technical assessment seemed more positive than they had feared. However, Dame Patricia continued, and the single word sent ripples of tension through the assembled group. Our assessment must consider not just the current condition of the dress, but the cumulative effects of the proposed use. Professor Henderson rose to present the detailed risk analysis that had consumed much of their investigative time. The wedding ceremony itself poses manageable risks, provided that environmental conditions are carefully controlled and handling is minimized. But our analysis extends beyond the ceremony to include transportation, final fittings, photography sessions, and the inevitable handling that occurs during such events. He produced a series of detailed charts showing stress points on the dress where decades of careful preservation could be undone by a single moment of careless handling. We calculate the cumulative risk of irreversible damage at approximately 15% across all phases of the proposed use. While this may seem like acceptable odds, we must remember that we're discussing an artifact that cannot be replaced or meaningfully restored if damaged. Dr. Mitchell presented the cultural and historical analysis that had proven most challenging for the panel to evaluate. Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress represents far more than personal family history, she explained. It embodies the hopes and aspirations of the British people at a crucial moment of national recovery. It connects contemporary Britain to the young princess who dedicated her life to service and duty. The symbolic value of this garment extends far beyond its material worth. The cultural analysis seemed to support the Guardian's position that the dress belonged to national history rather than family tradition. But Dr. Mitchell's next words surprised everyone present. At the same time, we must consider Queen Elizabeth's own beliefs about the living monarchy. Her Majesty consistently emphasized that royal traditions must remain relevant and meaningful to successive generations. She believed that the monarchy's strength came from its connection to real families and real emotions, not from its function as a historical museum. Dame Patricia reclaimed the floor for the panel's final recommendation, the moment that everyone had been waiting for with mounting anxiety. After extensive deliberation, we have concluded that the decision cannot be made on purely technical grounds. The physical risks, while real, are manageable with proper precautions. The cultural arguments are compelling on both sides. Therefore, our recommendation addresses not just this specific situation, but the broader principles that should guide such decisions in the future. The pause that followed seemed to last forever, though it was only seconds before Dame Patricia delivered the panel's verdict. We recommend that Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress be worn by Miss Eliza Lopez for her wedding ceremony, subject to strict conditions designed to minimize risk and preserve the garment's historical integrity. The reaction in the throne room was immediate and visible. Queen Camilla's relief was palpable, while Sergeant Major Harrison's face showed clear disappointment and something approaching anger. The other Guardians exchanged glances of disbelief and frustration, but Dame Patricia was not finished with the panel's recommendation. However, we also recommend that this decision establish a formal protocol for future use of royal historical artifacts. No garment of similar historical significance should be used for contemporary purposes without undergoing the same rigorous assessment process that we have conducted here. She produced a second document outlining the specific conditions that would govern the dress's use for Eliza's wedding. The dress may be worn only for the actual ceremony and may not be used for pre-wedding photography, rehearsal activities, or reception events. Transportation must be conducted by specialist art handlers using museum-quality protective containers. The ceremony venue must maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions. Most importantly, a team of conservation specialists must be present throughout the event to monitor the dress's condition and intervene if any problems arise. The conditions were extensive and would make the wedding significantly more complex and expensive, but they addressed many of the technical concerns that have been raised by the preservation experts. King Charles rose to formally accept the panel's recommendations, his voice carrying both authority and relief that a resolution had been reached. Dame Patricia, Professor Henderson, Dr. Mitchell, I want to thank you for your thorough and thoughtful analysis. Your recommendations will be implemented in their entirety, and the protocols you have established will govern similar decisions in the future. But even as the king spoke, it was clear that the resolution would not heal all the divisions that had opened during the controversy. Sergeant Major Harrison requested permission to speak, his military bearing rigid with barely controlled emotion. Your Majesty, while I respect the expert panel's decision, I must state for the record that I believe this sets a dangerous precedent. We are treating irreplaceable historical artifacts as family property rather than national treasures. The king's response was measured but firm. Sergeant Major, your concerns have been heard and considered. The expert panel has balanced all factors and made their recommendation. Our duty now is to implement their decision as safely and professionally as possible. But Harrison was not finished. His voice rose slightly as years of suppressed emotion finally found expression. Your Majesty, with greatest respect, that dress does not belong to any individual or family. It belongs to the British people. It represents their hopes, their history, their connection to the crown. Queen Elizabeth understood this, which is why she never wore it again after her wedding day. The silence that followed Harrison's words was deafening. Everyone present understood that he had crossed a line from respectful dissent into something approaching insubordination. Colonel Weatherby stepped forward, clearly intending to intervene, but King Charles raised his hand to halt any disciplinary action. Sergeant Major, your devotion to my mother's memory is noted and appreciated, but your role is to protect royal property according to the decisions made by the royal family, not to determine how that property should be used. The exchange might have ended there, but Harrison's years of military service and personal devotion to Queen Elizabeth had reached a breaking point. His next words would be remembered as the moment when loyal service collided with personal conscience in the most dramatic way possible. Then, I can no longer serve in that role, Your Majesty. The resignation was delivered with military precision, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. Harrison removed his ceremonial badge of office and placed it on the small table beside the royal chair, a gesture that seemed to echo through the enormous room. I swore an oath to protect the crown and its possessions. I cannot be part of a decision that I believe betrays that oath. Colonel Weatherby immediately stepped forward to accept Harrison's resignation, but the damage to palace morale was already done. Other members of the Guardians looked at each other uncertainly, clearly wrestling with their own consciences about whether to follow Harrison's example. Mrs. Campbell rose slowly, her years of service evident in her careful movements. Your Majesty, I too must respectfully resign my position. I cannot be part of risking something that Queen Elizabeth entrusted to my care. The domino effect that followed was swift and devastating. Within minutes, nearly a dozen senior staff members had tendered their resignations, creating a crisis of personnel that threatened to disrupt palace operations for months. King Charles watched the unprecedented exodus with obvious dismay, understanding that the wedding dress controversy had exposed deeper philosophical divisions about the nature of royal service and the balance between tradition and adaptation. Queen Camilla sat in stunned silence, realizing that her loving gesture toward her granddaughter had created the most serious internal crisis the royal household had faced in decades. The victory of winning the right to use the dress felt hollow in the face of such massive staff opposition. Sir Edmund Hastings quickly began calculating the practical implications of losing so many senior staff members simultaneously. The royal household operated on carefully choreographed precision, and the sudden departure of experienced personnel would create operational challenges that could affect everything from state visits to daily security arrangements. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Mrs. Dorothy Campbell, the former royal dresser who had served Queen Elizabeth most intimately, approached Queen Camilla directly. Your Majesty, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, I want you to know that this is not personal. I believe you are acting from love for your family. But I also believe that Queen Elizabeth would be heartbroken to know that her wedding dress became a source of such division and conflict. The words hit Queen Camilla like a physical blow. Throughout the controversy, she had convinced herself that she was honoring the late Queen's memory by connecting her legacy to future generations. The possibility that Elizabeth would have disapproved of the entire project had never seriously occurred to her. As the formal meeting concluded and the participants began to file out of the throne room, the full magnitude of the crisis became apparent. The expert panel had provided a technical resolution to the preservation questions, but they had not healed the emotional and philosophical divisions that the controversy had exposed. The wedding dress project would proceed, but at a cost that no one had anticipated. The unity and loyalty that had always characterized the royal household had been fractured, perhaps irreparably. The resignation of so many senior staff members would create practical problems for months to come, but the deeper damage to the institution's internal cohesion might last for years. In the days that followed, attempts were made to minimize the public impact of the staff resignations. Official statements spoke of retirement and career transitions rather than principled opposition to royal family decisions. But within the insular world of royal service, everyone understood what had really happened. Eliza Lopez finally wore Queen Elizabeth II wedding dress on a crisp December morning, and she looked every bit as radiant as her great-grandmother had 75 years earlier. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly under the watchful eyes of conservation specialists, and the dress survived the event without visible damage. But the photographs from that day tell a more complex story than the official accounts suggest. The joy on Eliza's face is unmistakable, and Queen Camilla's satisfaction at seeing her plan come to fruition is evident. But careful observers noted the absence of many familiar faces among the palace staff and attendants. The empty positions left by the resigned guardians have been filled by newer staff members who lack the institutional memory and deep personal connection to Queen Elizabeth that had motivated the opposition. The royal household continued to function, but something essential had been lost in the process. Sergeant Major Harrison found employment with a private security firm, but he never spoke publicly about his years of royal service or the circumstances of his resignation. Mrs. Campbell moved to a quiet cottage in Scotland, where she kept her memories of Queen Elizabeth private and her opinions about the wedding dress controversy to herself. The dress itself was returned to its climate-controlled display case immediately after the ceremony, showing no signs of its brief return to active use. Future visitors to the royal exhibitions would see no evidence of the crisis it had caused or the relationships it had destroyed in the process. But within the royal household, the legacy of the wedding dress controversy continued to influence relationships and decisions for years to come. The balance between preservation and adaptation, between institutional loyalty and personal conscience, between honoring the past and serving the present, had been tested in ways that would not be forgotten. Queen Camilla achieved her goal of connecting her granddaughter to royal history through the wedding dress. But the price of that connection proved higher than anyone had anticipated, creating divisions and resentments that would shape the royal household long after the wedding photographs had faded and the dress had returned to its silent vigil behind museum glass.